Hello everyone, this is Heidi Walters from ESCO, and we will get started here in just a couple of minutes. Wait a minute. Hello again, this is Heidi Walters of the National Association of Energy Service Companies. Welcome to our first webinar of the year entitled Smart Building Technologies, Opening the Door to New Opportunities for ESCOs. I just want to make a couple of remarks before we get started. As a reminder, NAESCO's Federal Market Workshop is on March 14th in Washington, D.C., and we still have some space available, so if you haven't registered yet, I suggest you do so very soon. We're going to be closing registration next week, online registration, but you can also register on site. There is one AIA CEU available for this webinar. So if you need a certificate of attendance and an evaluation form, contact me after this webinar and we will get that to you this week. My email is heidi@naesco.org. We are recording this webinar, so it will be available for use after the fact. It usually takes me a day or two to get everything together, but I will send a link to the recording and the presentation to everyone probably by Wednesday. Casey our presenter asked that you submit questions throughout the webinar, and she will answer them at different points throughout the duration of the presentation and afterwards. So please use the question feature as we go along. Our presenter today is Casey Talon. She is the Principal Research Analyst with Navigant Research, contributing to the Building Innovations Program. With a background in economics, environmental science, and policy, she has a deep experience as an analyst and consultant in the building technology sector. Casey has provided consulting services for executive decision makers on the business challenges related to climate change and sustainability, as well as opportunities for investment in energy efficiency and smart buildings. She holds a Master of Public Administration degree from Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs and a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. I will now turn over the presentation to Casey. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you. So, as Heidi said, on the Building Innovations team here at Navigant, we really explore the ways in which technology is being adopted and redefining the way we live and work in our spaces, everything from the smart home through lighting, energy efficiency in smart buildings. That's been the core area of expertise and focus of my research. I'm excited to share some perspective today and highlight what we're hearing in our research, where there are opportunities, and what does it mean potentially for new opportunities in the ESCO market. So to kick things off, as Heidi mentioned, there is a CEU available, and so with that in mind, tried to shape a few learning objectives for today's presentation. So hopefully at the end of the call, you'll be able to answer these questions. First of which is, what are the key technologies that enable a smart building strategy for facilities management? How has the smart building market evolved over the last decade? What is the competitive landscape for these technologies and solutions? And finally, how is the as-a-service trend potentially impacting the ESCO market? So hopefully those will be addressed as we go. And as Heidi mentioned, feel free to enter questions in the chat function as we go, and I will address questions as we dive into these different aspects of our research. To start things off, I wanted to talk about the idea of the smart building as a concept. I think that we have heard the idea of OT, IT convergence in a lot of different industries, that operations technologies and information technologies are really being infused to provide more innovation in the approach for a whole lot of different industries. In the commercial and public building space, or really around facilities management, that idea is really core to the development of a smart building. Something that's been talked about for a number of years, but we really think that we're seeing a point of inflection, and we'll dive into what are the kind of key market dynamics shaping that assumption. But I think it's a really interesting challenge. We have been looking at the idea that when you start to have a more integrated approach, you can break down some of the traditional silos that have been the status quo in terms of facilities management. So it's not about just improving the sequencing of HVAC systems alone, or how lighting is scheduled, but really how are the interactive effects of managing different systems, but then looking much broader, taking a whole lot of variety of data streams and creating a more comprehensive view of what's happening in a building, and what does that mean for the business bottom line. There is somewhat of a fragmented landscape when we think about the smart building. That idea is a very broad umbrella, and certainly there is a full spectrum of solutions that can fall into that space, from simple sort of dashboarding and visualization through to fully integrated optimization solutions that look not only even at one building, but across an enterprise, a portfolio of buildings, a campus, a hospital network. So we'll talk about what that looks like and kind of how do you navigate the differences in what we're seeing in the market. On the demand side, we're seeing some interesting trends as well. We talk a lot about a new sort of upward pressure in the market. This ties to the consumerization of technology. This is a theme that we've heard, again, in different sectors, but it seems these days everyone can talk about the Internet of Things, right? I rely on devices that make my personal life more convenient, more comfortable, and as a result, we're seeing indications that cumulative impact is putting new pressure on building owners to invest in technology. They're realizing that the amount of technology that they deploy, how efficient, how comfortable, how their buildings really feel as an experience is impacting their brand, is impacting their bottom lines and their ability to really attract and retain occupants, employees, for example. So we'll dive into that as we go through the presentation today. I think at the end, what the idea is that there is an opportunity here, and that's because employing technology, we're seeing evidence that impacts the bottom line, improves the value of these facilities, but also there's a top-line opportunity. The idea that you can translate a facility into a business asset. And what does that mean? The idea that the building can become a kind of platform enabled by digital technology. And so those are some of the ideas that we're going to also dive into. As a result, there's an evolution of roles and responsibilities within an organization. There's a new set of partnerships emerging, not only between customers and their solution providers, but on the supply side. We're seeing some very interesting partnerships emerge between technology providers and service providers. Again, this concept of converging systems, and then we'll look at what that means as new business opportunities across the market. So, we've been looking at what we see as an evolution of the smart buildings market. It is still relatively young, I would say an immature market, a lot of great examples from early adopters. But we do think that there's some interesting market forces working together And it really comes down to this idea of digital transformation. There's innovation in technology, advancement in information technology, machine-to-machine learning, even explorations into how artificial intelligence can play a role in analytics and in the way in which we operate our facilities. There's a shift in demand, customers looking to ensure that they have actionable strategy, that they're really seeing improvements and that can be measured toward their sustainability, for example. And that there is a shift in delivery. We're going to talk about the new business models emerging around software as a service, and then increasingly sort of everything as a service. That is a theme that we're seeing across our research. I think is an interesting lens into what this could potentially mean for the ESCO market. When we talk about digital transformation in the commercial building, there are certainly challenges in this process, but the upside is significant, and as a result, we see a huge number of new market entrants really vying for market share, looking to see how they can engage customers. And the bottom line is that these new solutions create a platform, or create an infrastructure of data that generates, collects, aggregates, translates that data into information that really resonates with a new set of stakeholders across an organization, and that ultimately derives action. That's fundamental here, that it's not just about a bunch of new technology. I mean, we hear that all the time in our research. Customers don't want to just hear about new technology for the sake of deploying it, but they want to understand what does it mean for their day-to-day performance, what their day-to-day operations teams have to deal with, or how it impacts their occupants. And so that is really core to what the value proposition is here, that this idea of a smart building translates into really impactful action. And so what are the enabling technologies that we're talking about? I mean, this isn't necessarily a brand new market. I mean, many of you on the phone have probably been deploying connectivity and automation systems for many years. And so we want to just take a few minutes to talk about the enabling technologies. What really are we talking about here? What's different? I'm actually going to move from the bottom up here, and it will sort of help frame the kind of universe of technologies that can be deployed together to enable the idea of transforming a facility into a smart building. Building automation and control systems, these are really the infrastructure that has been used to manage building systems, often in large buildings. These are the sort of traditional BAS, BMS systems that have helped the largest buildings, the largest commercial buildings, ensure that they're scheduling, that the lights are on, and the heat is on when people are in the building. And it's really around focus on engineering and just sort of operations team, kind of at the floor in the boiler room, if you will. We then have this array of software. Historically, we may have segmented as BMS versus BEMS, or Building Energy Management Systems. That's a market we spend a lot of time thinking about. That's really core to the smart building and an area of a lot of evolution and change. Obviously, there are probably folks in the audience who have offerings in those categories, and they're looking at how to enhance the capabilities. What kind of applications are they able to do? But just want to point out there's sort of two objectives, one of which being a front end really directed at the operations teams, the nuts and bolts of what's happening and the way in which building systems are being managed. And then a layer on top of that that's really getting into more of the analytics, the business side of facility operations. Originally, this was sort of the BEMS space, the idea that you could translate operational data into some financial metrics, starting with energy efficiency. The compelling story, it's straightforward. Being able to track that you have operational improvements to deliver energy savings would impact the bottom line. You've reduced utility bills, for example. That market's evolving quickly. We're seeing more and more solutions come to availability that look at even broader sets of metrics beyond energy, things like space utilization, indoor air quality, healthy buildings. We're going to dive into that a little bit. But thinking about it as that sort of layer of software and analytics. And then on top of that, sort of the hot commodity of IoT. This is really about the deployment of cost-effective devices. They may be wireless, sensors and controllers, an infrastructure of technology that's really more cost-effective, but also capable of getting very granular data. Seeing a lot of interesting innovation in this space as well when we think of quote-unquote edge devices. These are much more cost-effective devices that may be deployed within the facility that can actually compute what's happening. It's not just the sensor, counting movement, but being able to actually translate that into some information. So those are the three primary areas of enabling technologies for the smart building. And it's really about that idea of increasingly cohesive and comprehensive data sets from a facility and then even out from there into the portfolio, the campus, being able to speak to the most comprehensive view on what's happening within these facilities. So, as I mentioned, I'm sure many of you have been looking at this space for a long time, and we wanted to spend a few minutes thinking about what we would talk about in terms of market evolution. This is illustrative. This is recognizing there's not necessarily a strict turning point, but these timelines reflect what we've seen in our research where there's been an uptick in investment or product announcements or shifts in the marketplace. And so, again, thinking about kind of three phases and then moving into today and into the future. So before 2005, much of the technology was really focused on just enhancing the very largest buildings. Smaller buildings were kind of a black box. It was difficult to get economies of scale. You weren't really targeting them for energy efficiency necessarily on the smart buildings lens. In 2005 and forward was really the introduction of the building energy management system space. That's really where we see as the inception of the smart buildings market, quote unquote. These solutions were really focused on visualization, being able to take data streams that may be coming from the BMS, but could also be things like smart meter data, utility billing. And it was really about helping building owners and operators start to get a sense of the financial impacts of their building operations through the lens of energy management. And those increases that were in energy efficiency that could be identified resulted in energy savings and, as a result, a bottom line impact and cost savings. Now, moving forward, we start to see really the impact of this idea of the influence of the IT markets. Cloud-based software and analytics start to come to the fore, really starting to think about how there could be a subscription or software as a service model where there are very low cost, potentially no upfront cost offerings for building owners that could really start to become even more comprehensive. Stories, and solutions that start to integrate not only just the energy management and the operations, but other data streams that are more aligned with business improvement, whether that be work order management, indicators on sustainability. So deeper data sets, non-energy metrics, and the story then is moving even further into this idea of the smart building, a more comprehensive view. As we look forward from today on, what we're really starting to dive into is what is this everything as a service? We'll look at some examples of lighting as a service. There's energy management as a service. Many of the software offerings in the market are really positioning to be sort of this building optimization as a service. This is really about the analysis of energy and non-energy metrics and integration of systems moving forward. Another really important part of the story is that we're seeing technology that's really capable of measuring and helping to improve smaller facilities or facilities that may not have that kind of traditional technology infrastructure of automation and controls. Or thirdly, maybe facilities that have that infrastructure, but it's very costly to operate, or they're looking to have some kind of secondary option in terms of how they're optimizing their systems. So here, I want to think a little bit more about this digital foundation, because obviously we were talking about this analytics and the software piece being central. What does that process look like? And so we just have this bit of schematic here to kind of walk through what that could look like for a customer. And we talked about the fact that there's hardware, software, and services embedded here, but from a process standpoint, thinking through these sort of 4 steps. So first, you just connect. You're deploying devices potentially. You're kind of breaking down these siloed systems by starting to get a view what's happening throughout the facility or even portfolio or campus. you're collecting that data really and then starting to translate that into some information. That may be visualization, you may have heat maps, you may have dashboards, and that may speak to different stakeholders within the organization that use these tools. And those tools are going to look different. It may be managed by login. You know, the executives may have certain dashboards that speak to sort of reporting around the financial metrics, whereas engineering teams certainly going to get more granular, specific data on the operations of those systems. The process piece is where we're seeing some really interesting innovation. We're hearing a lot about machine-to-machine learning and really the analytics. So how are technology providers really utilizing software analytics to change the way they analyze system performance? Automated fault detection diagnostics is not new, but being able to utilize that for a broader set of the market more cost effectively. The idea of having algorithms that start to automatically detect, you know, repeating patterns in fault or problems in the way in which the facilities are being operated. This is a really interesting piece of the puzzle because it starts to change the economics for deploying this kind of solution. You know, as we have more sort of automated analysis, it becomes more cost effective and potentially more broadens the addressable market. As customers can rely on these software tools, they may pay for it as a subscription rather than necessarily hiring a full advisory team. And at the same time, on the vendor side, it can be a really interesting way of offloading some of the burden for analysis from, say, data scientists and engineers to open them to kind of deeper kinds of advisory engagements. So that's something we're really watching and seeing how that's unfolding. And then finally, this idea of optimize. There's, you know, a range in which the building owners may be comfortable with allowing third parties to really automate or, you know, control their systems. But the technology is there. And so it's a certain degree of market education awareness and also of mapping what the requirements are for a particular customer. But the technology is really advancing and enabling kind of ongoing system improvement to ensure you're really generating the savings from an energy perspective, but also improving the experience. And we'll dive further into what that means, but that is sort of the last point in this progression. And as you see across the bottom here, it's about monetizing. I mean, ultimately, we're watching how we're seeing new business opportunities emerge. What does this mean in terms of the way in which technology providers are engaging with their customers? So this is going to speak to the idea of this broader set of stakeholders, actionable insight. You know, so we hear a lot about how the decision-making is evolving, and when we look at the class of smart building solutions, I'm really being positioned to the executives, decision-makers, or the leadership within an organization. The idea that these tools can help in decision-making in the same way as some of their business intelligence tools. But there's also really important influencers in the market. And so the idea that the most successful deployments really have a broad set of these stakeholders at the table from the outset. I heard an interesting story in a recent conversation for a report. We were doing some research on, you know, this idea of who's making the decision, who has the checkbook, if you will, what leads to success. And she spoke about one of their most successful engagements having the HR lead at the table, which I thought was really interesting. And she said, you know, the bottom line is that HR person wants to know that there are investments being made to protect and ensure that the employees are safe and comfortable. But also from a branding perspective, they were very excited, the idea that they were creating smart buildings that would attract and retain the best employees. It's an interesting illustration of the kind of broad set of stakeholders that might find interest in these kinds of projects. In terms of influence, you know, the facilities management and engineering teams still really need to be involved. Obviously, from day-to-day operations, if they don't buy into the deployment, they can certainly derail the success of the project. But they can also see great value and upside. If the solutions are positioned correctly, they can illustrate how it takes some of the burden off their day-to-day chores, that there's a tool to help them prioritize, you know, their effort and their teams. And then, you know, ultimately that we're hearing increasingly that the decision is rolling up to the CFO or CEO or top of the leadership pyramid, if you will. What does this mean in terms of the competitive landscape? It's been really interesting to see the emergence of smart building offerings from a whole array of technology and service providers in the market. This is just an illustrative, selection of logos, really just meant to showcase the kinds of players that are out there, and many more could be pointed to. But I think it's a good point to sort of stop and step back and think about what's happening here. We talk about the idea that you sort of thought about the building incumbents, the Schneiders and Siemens and Honeywells, maybe folks on the phone that have been in this space for a really long time. They have deep engagements, they have deep customer relationships, and they're utilizing maybe information technology to help evolve their offerings. We're seeing that they may now face new competition, that there's a whole slew of startups that have the ability to be really nimble and really innovative and create those algorithms, those analytics tools that could then eventually be an acquisition or partnership or a white label, something that helps amplify the capabilities. We're also seeing professional services. This is a couple examples from the real estate realm, but really high profile investments into this idea of the smart building. And that's it's an interesting illustration where you think that the commercial real estate realm, for example, their job was to make sure facilities were operating well, but they know they can offer something as a value add when they layer on the smart building and helps to differentiate themselves against their competition. So that's a space we're seeing a lot of activity. Some of it may just be strategic at this point, developing offerings. Others are really rolling out full services. Lighting has been a really interesting area, and HVAC, and I just point to these because some of these manufacturers historically sold a piece of equipment. Increasingly, there's interest in how do they provide networked, controllable, remotely accessible equipment. How can that equipment and that set of data influence decisions across how the facilities are operated? And that infrastructure of connectivity and analysis, can it utilize other data streams? Can they be the backbone for a smart buildings deployment? So we're seeing some very interesting activity from those two realms as well. And then finally, obviously we're interested in energy. I just wanted to point out, the activity that we're seeing on the utility and energy provider side. Two examples here, are competitive retailers coming from European markets. There's a lot of activity where companies are recognizing this new opening market for the smart building. Companies like Engie acquiring Ecova, launching Engie Insights, or NG Insights, Centrica with Direct Energy and Panoramic Power. The idea that at the foundation there can be a smart building toolkit that can translate into greater customer engagement, a deeper kind of partnership. And I think that it tells the story across these different buckets, the movement toward a more sustained engagement. I think it's really interesting from an ESCO perspective because obviously ESCOs have a long history of longer-term engagements, more comprehensive partnerships, those retrofits that span, across the entire facility, a multi-year kind of model. But I think that this is a signal that there is new opportunities emerging on the private sector, which I think historically has been a bit more difficult to engage. And so it signifies potentially a door opening in new ways and being able to sort of leverage your core domain expertise and capabilities with another potential audience. Now this is a snapshot from a recent Navigant Research leaderboard. So we do these reports kind of across the different sectors that we cover, and we have a process, a methodology in which we evaluate the execution and the strategy for what we look at as key industry players and assess kind of their positioning in a particular subset of the market. Really why I wanted to highlight this was I think this is a great illustration how we see a convergence and an evolution across the technologies in the smart building space. This is an IoT for lighting leaderboard, and what you'll notice right away are some non-traditional sort of luminaire or lighting brands represented and competing. I think we're going to see more and more of that, and I think it's just a great illustration of a moving market, in that, lighting in particular as a platform to become the backbone of a smart building deployment. It's a really compelling illustration of a whole new set of competition, and just a shifting landscape. So diving a little bit further into this idea of supply side competition. On the left, what I have here is just sort of that stack, moving from data through to impact. And why I have that there is I think that there are different potential vendors or supply side players that really have core domain expertise in these different layers. There are engineering teams that really can get into that action and ensure that those systems are performing. There's software developers that can get to translating that data into information. There are IT players that have the infrastructure for connectivity, really getting data out there. And so it's changing the way in which solutions are coming to market. I have just a couple quick quotes here that again highlight a lot of different players really interested in the smart buildings market. I think we've heard from IBM for a number of years on their smart buildings platform as one of their kind of smart world platforms, but this is just an interesting snapshot. Watson coming to the fore, that they're seeing that capability as part of energy management or building management as a service. JLL positioning to provide smart building solutions to the government. And then Acuity Brands, this is a really recent acquisition, but again highlights how potentially non-traditional players or players that had kind of a siloed point solution are trying to become smart buildings providers. So Acuity acquired this startup, really to amplify their capabilities on the sort of IoT play. So I just thought those were three examples of how we continue to see the market evolve. And it's a bit of a paradigm shift in terms of how we operate commercial facilities, public or private sector facilities. I think that we evaluate kind of what makes for a successful solution in the market, and I think we hear a lot about the integration capabilities, that things can be open and interoperable, scalable, kind of be on this journey with the customer. Again, as you think about the sort of spectrum of building owners in the market, whether it be a small K-12 school system or a very complex university campus, they're going to have different needs today, in the near term, and even into the longer term. So being able to be in that journey with them, demonstrate that there's staying power, but also flexibility. So I think that we'll dive into this idea of partnership and being able to work with the customers and deploy what they need as they go through the journey of developing smart buildings. And I think there's sort of a cautionary tale too. I mean, we have been watching a lot of acquisitions over the years, some of which have been very successful, some of which the startups may be just kind of consumed or cannibalized by the larger parents. And as a result, I think there's a partnership landscape that's emerging, but also it is an opportunity. So it's just a bit of kind of the strategic thinking behind the acquisition path. Can the sort of nimble, innovative startup become integrated in a larger organization and continue to develop? So those are some of the kind of lessons that we're watching, and as we see the market continue to evolve and mature. So now, on that note, I think about the ecosystem of partners. So we've been watching a lot of partnerships emerge, whether it be a joint venture, kind of an equity partnership, intersectional or vertical. There's great illustrations as you kind of think about these primary and secondary activities in operating buildings. Certainly there are some very large companies that have somewhat turnkey offerings, but really when you think about the smart building, it's a broad set of requirements and capabilities. And so we're seeing some success through these partnership models. Really ensuring that you stay true to your domain expertise, but amplify that with the kind of innovation that's being demanded. And on the flip side, for some of those smaller, really innovative, nimble companies, being able to scale, utilizing the channels of a large incumbent and that incumbent then therefore being able to differentiate themselves. So some interesting dynamics around partnerships that we think really are fundamental as we see the idea of the smart building and the digital future kind of come to fruition. So why we think this is, a valuable journey from a technology provider standpoint, ultimately about finding a model for recurring revenue, enhancing and deepening the customer engagement. This is just kind of a schematic to sort of demonstrate the pathway of two approaches. So, that you can have this sort of linear progression project-based engagement in the traditional model. You identify a particular problem. Maybe it's sort of a pointed problem. There's an opportunity to do some retrofits of some capital expenses. And that process is scoped out. There's a process that's underway. And then maybe a few years down the road, there's a realization that maybe that equipment isn't running optimally and there's a re-engagement. It's a bit linear, right? And there's an endpoint in sight. Whereas we think about the development of the smart building approach and as a service, smart buildings becomes an ongoing cycle. And so the idea that you have ongoing advisory, you have potentially real-time data, continuous information on how things are performing, that's a really valuable model for recurring revenue. And also, that you could utilize this sort of smart buildings infrastructure, the low-cost analytics, even light services as the foundation, and that can really open up to opportunities for adjacent products and services, for better insight into when early on they're going to need to retrofit a piece of equipment, or even performance data if you have a portfolio of buildings, as a manufacturer being able to identify the performance of one vendor versus another. So those are kind of some of the real benefits of this smart buildings approach from the supply side. Stepping back, the smart building fits into a much bigger picture of industry transformation that we spend a lot of time thinking about here at Navigant, and that is the development of the energy cloud. There's probably ways you've heard about this sort of evolution of the market, but we really think that there is a significant transformation underway. So we've all understood this sort of one-way infrastructure of the electricity grid, central, large generation, traditional transmission and distribution, often very heavily fossil fuel-based. That's been the model for decades, hundreds of years. And what we're seeing is really rapid adoption of distributed energy resources. And it's really creating a completely new infrastructure and a new set of expectations, and also a completely different paradigm of interaction between energy supply and demand. And that's really the starting point. I mean, once you have this kind of relationship, new business opportunities emerge. There's a huge amount of value creation that could come from there. So you look at this schematic and you see these different, what we're calling nodes within the energy cloud. You're certainly still going to have large central generation, renewables, the smart home, electric vehicles. What I want to hone in on is the building, the smart building, and the idea that the smart building, when you have that digital infrastructure, you have the automation and controls, you can suddenly have this really dynamic asset. There's, early illustrations of how, the technology will continue to emerge, starting with, programs like automated demand response, but that there's a bigger picture opportunity here, and that building owners can really become energy asset owners as well. Since you exercise, sort of think what that could look like for example, for universities or for cities, city-owned buildings, or healthcare, for example. And so that's kind of the backdrop for what we look at as we think forward into the longer term. What's the sort of future of these digital buildings? How can the smart building play in the bigger picture? And so I just want to provide that kind of backdrop when we think into the longer terms and really how the smart building could be an asset. And thinking too, not even just the individual building owner, but if you were to have a platform where you can aggregate, say, buildings within, localized buildings within a few blocks of a city, how that can play into a smart cities initiative. Or once you have that data infrastructure, What does that mean when you know the electric vehicle load on your campus, or you know how your renewable energy can help balance potential challenges on the grid? Those are some of the questions that we're exploring and we're seeing as a longer-term pathway for the smart building. From a customer's perspective, we sort of outlined this pathway. You know, that there's the first part of the process of just getting your understanding of the energy, getting a visual, starting to have better insight into what's happening, and then the second stack of opportunities that are increasingly available as you deploy smart building technologies. Moving into the idea of building to grid and vehicle to building. So building to grid is this idea when diving in and the idea that the building is really part of that energy cloud. What that means is that you have the controls, automation, and the infrastructure in place to really be dynamic responsive to grid signals, potentially island in certain situations, and really change the way systems and space is used within a facility or a campus in reflection of conditions that would impact the power supply, the reliability and the resiliency of that power. The building to grid also starts to set the idea of the building as a platform. There are a lot of people using that word. But that once you have this profile of data, what could that translate? How could you monetize that data? As a building owner, is that something that there's value to new customers trying to sell? They have better information around how the facility is being used. Vehicle to building is another platform that we're looking at. And so sort of telling that trajectory of opportunity into the longer term. And then thinking a little bit further around how the smart building can be positioned. And what are the sort of wide-reaching benefits that come with the smart building? Cost reductions are certainly first and foremost. I mean, ultimately, has to make financial sense. Customers really are obviously sensitive. They understand the ROI, and the rapid ROI for software-based solutions is obviously quite compelling. There's an increasing focus, as I said, on resiliency and reliability, and we think that is a fundamental driver for some of the investment in distributed energy resources. The whole team of folks focused on that element, so if there's questions on that, I can connect you with some experts on that realm. But just the idea, that there is a way of managing what's happening within the facility, within the site, and then across the portfolio in a much more strategic way. And then sustainability. I mean, we're really seeing a lot of interest in sustainability. You're starting to see the emergence of science-based targets and internal carbon taxation or accounting. Obviously the very high-profile reporting programs that have been involved for a long time, but now also even sort of more of a mandate from localized level. At the city level, climate change targets, and starting to look at how buildings can play into meeting those greenhouse gas reduction goals within a city or state. The scalability issue, again, being able to work with the customers on this journey. Certainly it is a very fragmented landscape, and some customers really are never going to be on that pathway to building to grid, but they do have an opportunity to benefit from some smart building technologies. So I think the winners in the market having the ability to suss that out and position to support the broad set of needs kind of across the market. And then finally, this idea of simplifying operations. We hear a lot about just the changing dynamics of the workforce, the challenges in finding facilities management personnel, the skill set that is changing as we rely more and more on data-driven solutions. And so our building providers that are positioned to really be a partner can help building overcome some of those challenges. And this can, there's viable business case for the smart buildings across both the private and public sector. And so, we've seen the stories around healthcare, higher education, commercial real estate, and the smart city. Even recently, there was an announcement of a partnership between, say, for example, a utility and a real estate group. I know there was one where Georgia Power had partnered with the Pulte Group, and they were really releasing a whole smart home initiative. There was a German solar SMA working with Danfoss to do an integrated DER and controls solution with analytics tailored specifically for grocery store customers. So you're really seeing these interesting partnerships focused on providing solutions that will meet the needs of particular pain points. How does it resonate in terms of improving the business at hand? So with that, we have about 15 minutes left. Hopefully, then provided some valuable research or thoughts from our smart buildings research, and would definitely love to open it up to any questions. And again, you can type in your chat function, and I would be happy to address any questions. And if anyone is interested in finding out any more, my contact details are here on this last slide. There's a snapshot on our research, and yeah, happy to follow up offline as well.
I think we have one question here. Hold on. Oh, there are some questions here, Casey.
Oh, great. Let's see. I think they may have gone just to you, if you wouldn't mind reading them off or putting them in the chat function to me. I can answer them.
It's under the questions tab. Okay. The historical trend has been to go from single system controls to much more of an integrated set of systems. Can you comment on the impact of AI as an enabling technology to provide scalable integrated control systems?
Sure. Where we've been hearing a lot around AI is in the sort of first wave around predictive maintenance. How is AI able to really enhance the way in which the data is assessed? Can it automatically detect the anomalies, the patterns, and then really lead to improvements in predictive maintenance? I'd say that's sort of one of the first approaches that we're seeing in terms of where AI is being explored on the smart building side for facility management.
Okay. What cities are leading the smart cities change?
So there are a lot of different smart city initiatives. This is not my core area of expertise. I will acknowledge that. We could certainly follow up with some additional information. But I think some indicators in the U.S. that are really interesting are the benchmarking policies that have been started. Certainly that's an entry point. And we've seen that as intentionally kind of a carrot to say, you have to disclose your energy use. Will the nature of competition in real estate push you to start investing in smart buildings investments? But that's sort of a higher level illustration. Beyond that, there are certainly cities that are implementing greenhouse gas and climate change commitments, and some of the smart building technologies are playing a role in that paradigm. If that person wants to follow up with me by email, I'd be happy to provide some more detail.
Okay. How about cybersecurity?
Yeah, huge topic for sure. And I think, cybersecurity is one that we have been exploring. As you think about more and more network devices, the question becomes, are you opening the door to cyber breaches? I think there's been, some customers where they've just implemented a policy of none of these systems are going to be on our corporate network. They're going to run in parallel. We'll protect, our systems in that way. But it's certainly a high-profile issue. I think the cybersecurity, the protections within the devices themselves are becoming table stakes. So as you see IoT devices come to market, the cybersecurity robustness of those solutions is becoming critical, and it's not something that you're going to pay extra for, but that's going to be embedded. There are certification programs similar to what the credit card companies have gone through, but it's definitely an issue, and I think that fundamentally speaks to why we hear more and more IT decision makers and leadership being involved in true smart building strategies and deployments, because historically they could just be kind of a gatekeeper and say you can't deploy the solution on my network, but they are increasingly involved in helping to determine what the solution is and how viable it is. So I think cybersecurity will increasingly be a focal point. I think the market's getting more mature. For a long time, we felt that a lot of decisions, building owners didn't know exactly what they needed to ask. They knew they needed to say, is this cyber secure? But I think we're still kind of in an era of education and awareness. And I think there's a lot to be learned from kind of adjacent markets. So, there's certainly large customers that have been deploying, networked or SaaS-based solutions in their buildings for other business realms. And learning from what they have done to ensure that those systems are secure can certainly be great lessons learned for facilities management side of the organization.
Okay, what do you think is the biggest threat to ESCOs in this evolving market?
I think it's really about competition. I think you see examples all the time of, for example, in universities, kind of growing organic smart buildings strategies. That is an area that the ESCOs really could be a great partner. And so being able to figure out, how to sort of hedge the risk of potentially losing customers from that. I think that there's, the competitive landscape is changing. The expectation for utilizing digital technology. So, are the ESCOs staying abreast of those innovations? Are they finding new partners? Or are they developing those capabilities in-house? I think will be really important because as more, kind of solution providers that have been focused on the private sector have the ability to offer these digital solutions, it's an area of interest across the market. So I think just keeping an eye on the technology capabilities and also the competitive landscape.
A follow-up to that is, have you considered linking smart buildings with smart street lighting initiatives so that public sector clients can link portfolios of assets better?
I think the smart street lighting is an incredibly hot area, and I think it definitely falls in the realm of the smart cities work. So we have a whole practice. So I personally probably can't provide the greatest insight on that, but it's something we're really looking at. I think there's a lot of activity on the utility side, really being interested in that kind of investment opportunity on the city side, and then certainly the ownership of those lights and what that can look like. Again, if whoever sent that question, if they want to follow up, I can certainly connect them with some more information on that.
Okay, well, I hope everyone enjoyed the webinar. Thank you again, Casey. And if you do have questions, please email her. And if you need AIA credits, again, email heidi@nasco.org, and we will get you the paperwork for that this week. And I'll be sending out a link to the recording and to the presentation to everyone. So thanks again, and we hope you'll join us at our next webinar coming up in April. Thank you.
Thank you.